chat throughout the call today. We will not be answering those questions during the call in the chat or out loud. However, our team does review those questions at a later date, and we will post the results or the answers to those questions on our DDAP ASAM alignment website. In the future, if you have questions related to the topic, and we did get some questions for this specific topic, so thank you to those people that submitted those. Please send those to the ASAM email account at least 7 days in advance of the call so that we can address those questions during the call. If you have suggestions for future topics, we are always very eager and open to hearing those suggestions. So please also send those to the ASAM email account. Again, all those email accounts and that information is right here on this page. Okay, so for the agenda today, we are excited to be, again, talking about MAT across the continuum of care. I want to make it really clear today that this is the first of what I see, and I know that the other folks in the department see this as well, as a very high priority topic. And it's obviously, you all know it's a very large topic. We definitely cannot cover all the important aspects of medication-assisted treatment in just one technical assistance phone call. So this today is just merely a start of a variety of technical assistance and training opportunities that the department will present over the next year and moving forward. So please understand that if we don't touch on a specific topic today, or you feel like we're maybe focusing on one particular type of MAT more than another today, it's not because we feel like that type of MAT is more important. It's because we're just merely starting the conversation today. And we will be covering this in much more detail coming forward. The questions that you submit in the chat today will really help to inform and guide us as we develop additional technical assistance opportunities in the future. So please, please understand that this is just the start of the conversation today, and we're really excited to be starting this conversation in more detail today. Today, we're going to be having speakers from our Bureau of Program Licensure. Jody Skiles, Bureau Director, and Jackie Fahler, Drug and Alcohol Licensing Specialist Supervisor, will be presenting today on the regulatory and licensing aspects of providing MAT across the continuum of care. And Jeffrey Geibel, Director of Prevention and Treatment Division, will be presenting on specifics that are found in the Case Management and Clinical Services Manual, and going into a little bit of detail about what these specific requirements would look like on the ground. Finally, we are going to be answering some questions that you submitted prior to the call today. And we're going to also go through a couple of different scenarios that we've gotten a lot of questions on as well, more specifically related to methadone. But again, we will be focusing on all types of MAT in future conversations, and we're going to be touching on all three types today here as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues in the licensing division, Jackie Fahler and Jody Skiles, to start speaking a little bit about some of the requirements from the regulatory side.
So good morning, everyone. Jackie is not going to be on camera because it kind of gets a little complicated and we can't hear her. So this morning, I'm going to try to get rid of this stuff on my screen. We're going to be talking about the guidance for concurrent care for NTPs and residential facilities. And so I'm going to turn it over, Jackie. You can go ahead and take slide 1.
Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Jackie Fahler. As Kathleen said, I'm the Drug and Alcohol Licensing Specialist Supervisor in our Division of Licensing Inspection. Kathleen, can you go back one slide, please? Thank you. So this guidance, which is the next several slides, replaces the previous protocol that we had for the concurrent care. And we have it separated really into 3 areas. So it includes Ntp requirements, residential facility requirements, and then shared requirements. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So MAT generally refers to methadone, buprenorphine, and Vivitrol, which are the FDA-approved medications. This guidance is not for Vivitrol and is not for buprenorphine when it's prescribed by a private practitioner. What this guidance is it's for Ntps that are certified as an OTP through SAMHSA and have a DEA registration in the facility name. So in addition to your certificate of licensure, you also have a COA or a certificate of approval, and that certificate of approval designates either methadone and or buprenorphine. So this guidance specifically is for that area, or the regulation, the pieces that follow the Chapter 715 regulations. So the first, I believe it's 2 slides, are the Ntp requirements. So the first one is that Ntp physician is who will determine the dose. Any questions that come up regarding the Ntp dose or the methadone dose should be directed to the Ntp physician. As we go through, you'll see there are regulations attached to each one, and that's just as a reference. So the first one is the Ntp physician is responsible for determining dose. Any questions should be directly addressed with that Ntp physician. Jody, do you want to talk about number 2?
Yep. And secondly, as far as take-home goes, take-home doses, and an Ntp may not permit any more than 2 weeks to go home with a patient. We're going to be addressing this as if it is in a normal world. You'll see at the end of the slides that we're going to be giving you some guidance as far as the pandemic goes. But as far as this protocol goes, it says no more than 2 weeks take-home supply. And there's the regulation associated as far as 2 weeks and take-home doses. Next slide, please.
So number 3 is the Ntp still has to request an exception for off-site dosing. That comes through the extranet. And when that is approved, then a copy should be given to the residential facility. Number 4 is the labeling of take-home medication. That is the same, and that all of those are addressed in there, where it should be in the patient's name, the Ntp name, address, phone number. All of that packaging should follow the federal regulations.
Okay, and then as far as urine drug testing, as far as screening, this used to be that everything had to go through the Ntp. We've changed this that you can coordinate with the residential treatment program, that they can do the urine drug screen and coordinate and send that back to the Ntp. There's a requirement that an Ntp must do a drug screen 1 time a month. So as long as the individual has a urine test 1 time a month, it can go back to the Ntp. Just again, communication is important. And again, the regulation is tied there. Next slide, please.
So this slide begins the residential facility requirements. The first one is the residential facility should update their medication policies and procedures to include the use of methadone.
And next, we're going to talk a little bit about the chain of custody. If a patient leaves the facility against medical advice, that you always consult the DEA, and what happens, however medication, a policy and procedure should be updated, and contact the DEA. Don't just give medication back. Reach out to the facility, the Ntp's medical director, consult with them, and also consult with the DEA. We did review this with the DEA prior to developing this protocol again. So even though it is the patient's medication, they may not meet the 8-point criteria. So we are discussing this, but contact the DEA and the facility medical director. Next slide.
So this slide begins the shared responsibilities and the shared requirements. It's important to note that the take-home medication is the patient's medication. The residential facility is the custodian, but only the patient should have a key to the lockbox. And then that lockbox must be stored in a secure storage area.
And again, we talked about this chain of custody against medical advice. It's important to meet all those federal requirements around who's carrying, who's storing. The DEA suggests that you get an old locker, the patient has the key. They're the only one that has the key. If you are carrying the patient, if you're carrying the medication, it's the patient's medication. You have to meet all federal requirements. There are links in the back that will discuss that. Jackie, did we lose you?
Okay. No, I'm here. Sorry. So number 3 is the record requirements. Oh, did you already go through that? I'm sorry. We're going to talk about that a little bit further in the back.
Yes.
Next.
No, go
slide,
ahead.
Please.
No, we didn't talk about that. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the record requirements are going to be required with a valid consent. Any documentation that occurs in the residential facility, they should share that documentation with the NTP. That would suffice for the requirement that NTPs have regarding 2.5 hours a month. So they would not have to provide separate 2.5 hours a month, but that documentation for progress notes, et cetera, should be shared with the NTP and included in that record.
Right, and that was my fault, Jackie. Sorry, that was supposed to be mine. So there was a question. No, there was a question constantly running around about a client needs to come back to the NTP for their counseling while they're in another level of care, and that does not need to happen. If a patient is in a higher level of care, they don't need to go back for their counseling in the NTP. Just coordinate the notes. So sorry, Jackie, you were right. And
okay, so
and
the
then
next, I'm sorry.
Nope, you're good.
The next slide, this slide is regarding the reporting of unusual incidents. Residential facilities are responsible to report unusual incidents under 709. The NTPs are responsible to report unusual incidents under 709 and 715. The important piece on this is just coordinate what Jody said about coordination. You want to coordinate the submission of an unusual incident that occurs and decide who will submit that. And the reason for that is just so duplicates are not filed. Number 2 for medication errors is if the medication error is resulting in a discrepancy in the amount of methadone, that also needs to be reported. And there are reference regulations to reference in that number 2, but medication errors and any discrepancy in the amount of methadone would need to be reported.
Okay. And number 3, for all of our providers that are on the line, please begin using the electronic reporting system for your unusual incidents, and only use this. This is the system that we would like you to use. Do not fax incident reports. Do not email them if you are using the system, the electronic system. We only need one. If you email them and if you fax them after you put them in the electronic reporting system, you're only duplicating work for you and for us. Only use our form. That creates more work for everyone. So this is the form. Use this link. It is so much easier for everyone if you do it this way. So here is the link. If you have issues, you can send that to our RA account and we can help you to work through that. But there's the link to report. Okay, so here are your links to SAMHSA, the DEA. Oh, that's Jackie's. See, look at me, Jackie. I'm messing up all over the place. Shows you there's no perfection in the world.
That's okay. So these last 2 slides really are just additional links for your information. This is SAMHSA link. There's a DEA link. We have COVID guidance included as a link there. And then the next slide is the additional resources that we have that were published in regards to the COVID declaration of disaster regarding the pandemic. So that will continue through March 31 of 2022. So that is also included on here. And that, I believe, is the end of what we are presenting, and we're going to throw it over to Jeff.
Yep.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Kathleen mentioned, my name is Jeff Geibel. I am the Prevention and Treatment Division Director here at DDAP. And my role here is going to talk a little bit more about some of the requirements that are in the Case Management and Clinical Services Manual. So basically, kind of wanted to start with 2 slides that kind of define a little bit what medication-assisted treatment is, so that we're all on the same page. So MAT is the use of medications in combination with counseling and behavioral therapies for the treatment of SUD. It's been shown through numerous studies that the combination of medication and the therapies are effective in the treatment and help people maintain and sustain recovery. And again, it's a coordination of care between therapeutic and pharmaceutical interventions, and that is critical for individual success in recovery. And there are 3 FDA-approved medications at this point: methadone, buprenorphine, and Vivitrol. And as Kathleen mentioned before, we may have a focus today on one of the medications more so than the others, but through future webinars, we will be addressing all of the medications. And the medications are used, and individuals must have access to treatments based on their individual needs and preferences. So the SCAs are required to ensure the availability of the FDA-approved medications and to assist with payment for the medications. So to meet this requirement, the SCAs should have a knowledge of all the contracted providers within their area that are available to prescribe and or administer MAT by the type of MAT. They should have an understanding of the providers who can offer bridge medications until the patient can be connected to a provider closer to home or can offer more long-term or intensive type of treatment. And recognize there may be providers who cannot provide certain forms of MAT, and also be aware of providers who are refusing to treat patients on MAT. So the SCAs are required to educate their patients about the MAT options, and the SCA should consider that providers need to offer information on the various forms of MAT, what is available for the individuals. They should be informed, working with the provider to ensure individuals are informed of the efficacy, side effects, risks, benefits, different medication options, and then the consequences of not receiving the medication, such as the risk of treatment versus no treatment based on MAT. Provide information in a way that the individual, the patient, can easily understand, and it should be a shared decision-making between the patient and the provider. The SCAs are required to ensure medication and clinical therapeutic interventions are available at all levels of care, even if the treatment provider is not the prescriber of the medication. So an example would be the patient is admitted to an outpatient provider who does not provide MAT or certain forms of MAT. Then your options to consider: the SCA or the provider assists the individual in getting linked to an MAT provider. The provider allows the individual to be on MAT while getting services in their program. The provider supports the patient in their decision to be on MAT. The provider is in close contact with the MAT provider, and the provider is educated on common clinical issues that the individuals on MAT may experience. The SCAs are required to ensure medication and clinical interventions are available in all levels of care, even if the provider, again, is not the prescriber of the medications. And the SCA must ensure that their provider network at each level of care has a capacity to treat individuals on MAT. They should know the knowledge of the services available at each provider, and they need to understand and work with providers to overcome barriers in providing MAT. The SCAs are required to ensure that individuals' needs are met directly or through an appropriate referral to a prescriber. If the SCA is not providing the MAT directly to patients, then they must contract for those services through appropriate providers. The SCA is required to ensure that treatment and non-treatment providers do not exclude individuals on MAT from being admitted into services. And again, just emphasize that's both treatment and non-treatment providers. So you determine if providers are available to prescribe or administer all three forms of MAT. Determine if providers can offer bridge medications until they can get into a provider closer to home or who can offer more long-term or intensive treatment. Knowledge of providers who cannot provide certain or any forms of MAT. Knowledge of providers who refuse to treat patients on certain forms of MAT. And knowledge of treatment providers who treat patients on MAT, however, they may offer some inappropriate advice. An example listed there is it's important for you to taper off MAT as soon as possible, and you aren't really in recovery as long as you are on a specific medication, or who segregate patients on MAT from the general population. The SCAs are required to ensure coordination of care with proper consent occurs in situations where a prescriber and the SUD treatment provider are not the same. So a scenario would be patient A is receiving individual counseling at an SUD provider who does not have a MAT prescriber on site. So the coordination of care would look like the outpatient provider has active releases of information that allow for a steady flow of communication with the MAT provider. The outpatient provider holds treatment status meetings with the patient and the MAT provider. The outpatient provider facilitates team staff meetings that involve the MAT provider. Okay, the SCAs are required to ensure contracted providers admit and provide services to individuals who use MAT for SUD. So examples, you review records, interview staff, interview patients, people seeking involved in services, review the data. That includes information on the number of patients on MAT by type of MAT. Ask providers for a list of MAT programs they have relationships with and the type of MAT they provide. And the SCA should, providers do not have relationships with a provider for one certain kind of MAT, provide TA to assist them in developing a process through which these barriers can be rectified. So it's important for the SCA to have knowledge of treatment providers who treat patients on MAT. And it's also important to know that if they provide stigmatizing guidance, again, as mentioned before, taper off as soon as possible, you aren't really in recovery if you're on MAT, or who segregate individuals on MAT from the general patient population. So you need to educate the treatment providers regarding MAT, offer other options for the treatment providers to consider in their approach, and you can always ask for TA from DDAP to assist with these provider conversations. The SCAs are to ensure that provider capacity is sufficient to treat individuals who use MAT, and staff should be trained on all three forms of MAT, such as a mechanism of action, contraindications with other substances, side effects, risks, benefits, and understand the importance of checking in with patients consistently about their progress and helpful questions that the individual may want to ask. All staff should have the ability to coordinate with MAT providers. All staff should treat patients who are on MAT with dignity and respect, and who should support the patient's decision to be on MAT regardless of their own feelings or biases around that subject. You document MAT on the treatment plan, and you also should clearly document progress on MAT in the treatment plan. And the SCAs are required to provide information and referral regarding access to MAT to individuals who can obtain medications through other sources, such as medical assistance or third-party insurance. Providers should have a list of accessible Vivitrol, buprenorphine, and methadone treatment providers readily available for both patients and staff. And there's some listings there on places to find this information. And the SCA provides training and technical assistance on gaps in knowledge and availability of certain forms of MAT. And SCAs are required that all treatment, including medication, must be individualized. I don't know that that can be stressed enough. All services must be individualized. SCAs may not place limits on the type of service or medication or restrict the length of service. DDAP identifies state or federal funds that are available only to providers that permits use of FDA-approved medications in the treatment of SUD. Contracted providers that restrict admission based on medication may not receive these funds to treat an individual or provide any type of prevention, intervention, treatment, or treatment-related service. Again, I want to repeat that. Contracted providers that restrict admission based on medications that the individuals use may not receive those funds to treat any individual or provide any type of prevention, intervention, treatment, or treatment-related service. And just some considerations: if the individual is in a residential facility, that facility should at a minimum, train both clinical and medical staff who have any role in providing treatment to the individual patient. The individual should be mainstream. They should not be segregated into a separate track. You want to integrate treatments. And movement to and through each level of care must be supported by the ASAM criteria. Coordination of care between the programs is critical, obviously. The NTP clinical staff person or the patient's counselor should participate in evaluations, reviews of their individuals who are at the residential facility. Assigned residential staff should maintain individual and group progress notes, treatment plans, and treatment plan updates. And discharge planning and the development of aftercare plans should be coordinated with the NTP. The NTP is responsible for providing treatment services after discharge from the residential facility. And with the patient's consent upon discharge from the residential facility, copies of progress notes, record of services, treatment plans, updates, discharge summary, aftercare plan, and recommended level of care according to ASAM criteria, and any other pertinent documentation should be forwarded to the NTP, who then should have that in the individual's chart. And if treatment exceeds 30 days, the progress notes, etc., record of services should be forwarded to the NTP on a monthly basis. And I believe this goes back to Kathleen now to take over.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Jackie and Jody, for all that really helpful information. Before we go into the Q&A, I just want to remind folks that please continue to submit questions in the chat. However, we won't be responding to your questions today in the chat or addressing them in our conversation or our presentation today, but we will be answering your questions at a later date and then posting those to the DDAP website. So please continue to submit those questions. Those are extremely helpful for us as we have further conversations about MAT and offer additional technical assistance and trainings. But please know that we're not ignoring you, but we will be answering your questions at a later date. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going through some questions that we received from single county authorities and from providers leading up to the conversation today. And I'm going to go ahead and start with this first question that we received. When a MAT client relapses and does not want further help, is it appropriate to hand them their whole filled Suboxone prescription? And I just also, Jody and Jackie, if I misstate anything or if you have anything additional, please feel free to jump in here after I provide the response. But if it's a buprenorphine prescription in the patient's name from a private practitioner, so we're talking about an OBOT or something similar, the provider must give the prescription to the patient if they request it. That is their prescription, and you need to hand it to them if they choose to leave against medical advice. It is their prescription. I know that there might be a lot of questions that come up today related to this and other kind of Q&As that we're going to go through. So please submit those in the chat, and we're happy to address those by posting that on the website at a later date, or even providing additional technical assistance guidance on this topic. Okay, so I know this is a little bit wordy, but this is the question, and so we are going to kind of go through this. I think this is really helpful information. So the question is, our SCA has found that some MAT issues with our 3.7 WM and 3.5 inpatient providers not wanting to accept individuals who are currently on MATs and seeking higher levels of inpatient treatment, but wanting to continue on the MAT during inpatient treatment, or refusing to accept a referral for an individual who wants to start an MAT when the individual starts inpatient or 3.5. The provider claims they are still, quote, drug-free. I have shared with these providers via email our PACTA boilerplate contract language around MAT and the DDAP case management and clinical services manual. Is DDAP licensing this, or are they putting this on the SCAs for monitoring? So I just, Jeff very much kind of spoke about this in his presentation earlier, But, it is very, very clear in the DDAP Case Management and Clinical Services Manual that contracted providers must not restrict admission to any level of care based on medication use. It is absolutely inappropriate, and it is going to be something that is going to be monitored by the single county authorities. So the DDAP Bureau of Program Licensure does not monitor this for compliance. This is an SCA contractual requirement, and it is something that we will be enforcing very, very closely. So I don't know what else I can say to make that extremely clear. But no individual patient should be restricted admission to any level of care based on the MAT that they are on.
Kathleen,
yeah.
May I add just one more thing, and I forgot to say this to you earlier.
Yep.
The Bureau of Program Licensure no longer has licenses that identify programs as drug-free. That activity no longer exists in our world.
Thank you for clarifying that, Jody.
Yep.
Okay, going on to the next question. And again, I know this is very wordy. We are going to be posting the presentation in addition to the answers to other questions that we received today in the chat to the DDAP website. A lot of you have asked, will these slides be available? Yes, they will be available. We will post these to the DDAP website. All right, next question. This is again related to 3.7 and 3.5s. Asking for an acceptance letter from an OTP or OBAT confirming a client is a current/future patient and will be provided medication once discharged from the 3.7, 3.5 level of care. This has put a barrier to access treatment due to clients needing to make several attempts to get this information when most OTP or OBATs are reluctant to guarantee services without doing an in-person assessment or exam with the clients. This work has caused clients to no longer attempt to access that higher level of care. I just cannot stress enough it's a barrier to treatment to require an individual to provide proof that they can return to their narcotic treatment program or their OBAT as a requirement of admission. Now, I'm going to go on to state that so individuals who are on MAT and who want to stay on MAT that need residential care should be allowed to, number one, enter that facility and receive the treatment they need at the residential level of care. They should be able to, number two, stay on the appropriate form of MAT. And if there is not a verification available or a guarantee from the original provider, I'm just talking right now specifically about OBATs. I'm going to address NTPs in a minute. There is enough time in that inpatient level of care, that care coordination, the case management to facilitate a warm handoff so that there is no gap in MAT treatment once that patient leaves residential treatment and they step down to a lower level of care. There should be no gap in treatment. They should stay on that MAT. We all know people are at a higher risk of overdose when they leave residential treatment as it is. And stopping that MAT or not providing ensurety that that patient can continue the MAT would not be the right thing to do at all. It would be dangerous, in fact. So saying a couple different things here. Number one, patients should not have to prove that they can continue MAT in order to get into residential treatment. That is very, very important. Jody and Jackie, when we were reviewing this question, made sure to bring up the fact that if a patient is on methadone and they're enrolled in an MAT, and that methadone provider or that NTP provides the patient take-homes that the patient brings into residential care, that patient is still considered an active patient in that NTP program. They were not discharged from care at the NTP if they are providing take-homes. So this should be a non-issue in that circumstance. I think a lot of people are struggling with the OBAT prescriptions and that specific question. So more information is located in the response written here. Bottom line is that if a patient is not able to obtain a letter ensuring they can continue to receive MAT upon discharge, residential facilities are still very encouraged to still admit these patients, period. this should not be an added barrier to treatment. If this is the kind of level of care that they absolutely need, this should not be a barrier to treatment, period. All right, next question. The 2.5 psychotherapy requirements, some OTPs, we all know this is a regulation. So the 2.5 psychotherapy requirement, I'm just going to put OTPs, not some OTPs, require clients to participate in when they should be successfully discharged from OP. Clients are asking to taper off medication because they don't want to continue the 2.5 hours. I confirmed with SAMHSA there is no federal guidance requiring this, and DDAP sent out a bulletin documenting they no longer monitor PA code 715.16. DDAP might need to provide some technical assistance on how we should have conversations like this with providers. So this is such an important question, and we will be providing additional technical assistance on this very topic and related topics in future technical assistance phone calls. But I will say that one of the future technical assistance calls we're going to be having is around the 2020 National Practice Guidelines put out by SAMHSA for people who are diagnosed with opioid use disorder. And in these guidelines, it very clearly states that a patient's decision to decline the psychosocial treatment or the absence of available psychosocial treatment should not preclude or delay pharmacological treatment of opioid use disorder. So again, I'm going to repeat this. A patient's decision to decline psychosocial treatment or the absence of available psychosocial treatment should not preclude or delay pharmacological treatment of OUD. Medication-assisted treatment is a life-saving medication. This should not be a reason to ever discharge somebody or to take them off of MAT. But I will say this is, we are obviously very much focusing on individualized treatment as it relates to ASAM. And if somebody is having a hard time accepting therapy that is required through regulation, we need to be documenting all the attempts that we're making to try to engage that patient. So, lots of times if a patient is refusing therapy, there's obviously a reason for that. So it could be underlying trauma. Maybe that person has larger needs. Maybe they don't have a roof over their head. Maybe they don't have food. Maybe they don't have childcare. When you don't have those basic things, most of us know this, it is hard to really engage in therapy a lot of times. So maybe offering more intensive case management at that time, just continuing to document all the measures that you're taking to try to engage this person. That's the most important thing. Individualizing treatment, looking at the bigger picture, the whole picture there. So, all right, next we're going to be going through, I'm just looking at my time here. Okay, next we're going to be going through potential scenarios. And we kind of developed these scenarios around pretty common questions that we get into the ASAM account and other avenues as well. So this first scenario is if a residential provider is not a narcotic treatment program. So there's a few residential providers that are registered or licensed NTPs with the federal government, and they can provide methadone on site. But if the residential provider is not an NTP and cannot induct or provide methadone, and a patient is assessed as needing to start on methadone and the patient would like to start methadone. So the residential program has established relationships with narcotic treatment programs in the area, and they can coordinate the patient's induction on methadone while they remain in residential treatment. And that residential program could transport that patient to the NTP on a daily basis to be dosed and assessed as they're going through that induction period. Program and program support staff support the person in their decision to be on MAT, and that's very clear through engagements and dialogues with that patient that staff really does support them in their decision to do this. Program and program staff are in close contact with the MAT provider, so obviously that would mean appropriate releases of information signed, a steady flow of communication back and forth between the providers, and ongoing dialogue. And the provider or counselor is educated on the common clinical issues patients on MAT may experience. A couple more potential scenarios. Option one, a residential program obtains records from a patient's home narcotic treatment program, verifies this dosing record, and coordinates continued dosing at the NTP, which is in close proximity to the residential facility. The residential program transport the patient to the NTP daily to be dosed. Program and program support staff, they are supportive in the person's decision to be on MAT. Again, they're in close coordination with the MAT provider. and the provider and the counselor are continuing to be educated on common clinical issues that the patients on MAT may experience. So let's say that there's not a narcotic treatment program close by, and we know that this is a reality for many, many, many providers. We're a state that has a lot of large rural pockets that don't maybe have an NTP close by. So option 2 here, and this kind of closely goes with what Jody and Jackie were talking about, but a patient could obtain, let's say they're already a patient in an NTP in this circumstance, the patient could obtain 2 weeks to up to 28 days of take-homes, which the 28 days of take-homes, as we all know, that is something that is allowed right now with the COVID restrictions being lifted, or the regular federal restrictions being lifted because of COVID. So 2 weeks to 28 days of take-homes from the home clinic could be obtained. The residential facility could agree to safely store the medications while the person is in treatment. The residential staff observes patient as they take their dose daily, and the residential facility and the home narcotic treatment program are in close contact throughout the patient's stay, and they work collaboratively on discharge planning. So Jody and Jackie went into much more specific detail about how this would look in terms of lock boxes and things like that. So there's a lot of kind of coordination and planning, but it's definitely something that is doable, and we really encourage providers to look at this option. All right, so I did put together a list of some additional resources, and I really hope that you take an opportunity to look at these. Again, one of the future technical assistance calls that we're going to be doing is going to be on the actual national practice guidelines for the treatment of OUD put out by ASAM. These were originally developed in 2015 and were updated again in 2020. So if you have not taken a look at these are extremely, extremely helpful. And then we put some other resources up here as well. All right, so we're coming to a close here, and I just wanted to give you all a couple of reminders. So the next ASAM TA series call will be in early December from 10 to 11 a.m. and the topic is monitoring. So what is the monitoring going to be looking like for monitoring of the ASAM alignment across the continuum of care? That will be the topic for December. All of the slides that we went through today and eventually the questions that we answered that are coming into the chat will be posted to the ASAM transition webpage, which is located here. And again, if you have any questions or if you have suggestions, like I said, for future topics, we really welcome those. And if you need technical assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out to the RA ASAM account, which is located right here. And that is the end of the presentation today. It is 10:51. We do still have some time. If folks want to continue to submit questions in the chat, I will leave this open for the next 10 minutes so people can submit questions. And please look for this slide set to be posted on the ASAM alignment website sometime this next week. We thank you all for being on the call today, and we hope you have a good rest of the week.